The gavel's echo still haunted her ears, a sharp crack that had tried and failed to silence her. Karoline Levitt stood alone now, the weight of that moment lingering like a spark refusing to die. But before the fire ignited, before the courtroom erupted and the nation turned its eyes to her, there was a quieter beginning, one that pulsed with purpose, faith, and an unshakable call to stand tall. In the stillness of her apartment, a sanctuary carved out amidst the chaos of power and politics, Karoline Levitt traced her fingers over the small silver cross pinned to the collar of her navy blazer. It wasn't just a decoration, it was a quiet vow, a piece of her soul worn openly, a tether to something greater than the whirlwind of her days. At 27, she'd already carved her name into history as the youngest White House press secretary ever, a title that carried both honor and burden. The walls around her held no lavish portraits or trophies. Instead, they whispered of discipline, a neatly stacked pile of briefing notes, a crisp suit jacket hung with care, a life built on order and conviction. But that cross, it shone brighter than any accolade, a beacon of the strength she drew from deep within. The phone jolted her from her reverie, its ring slicing through the calm like a summons to battle. She didn't need to glance at the screen to know who it was. Only one voice carried that unmistakable fire, that blend of urgency and unyielding resolve. She lifted the receiver, and there he was, Donald Trump, his words crackling with energy, each syllable a spark ready to ignite. "Karoline," he said, his voice a force of nature. "There's something brewing down at the D.C. local court. A group of believers, good people, Christians, suing because they've been told they can't pray in public. It's an outrage, a disgrace. I need you there. Watch it, take it all in, and tell me what we're dealing with. Go, now." There was no room for hesitation in his tone, no pause for doubt. It was a command wrapped in trust, a mantle passed from one fighter to another. Her pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the surge of purpose that flooded her veins. This wasn't just another assignment, it was a collision of everything she held dear, her duty to the nation, her loyalty to the man who'd given her this platform, and the faith that had guided her through every storm. She could feel the weight of it pressing against her chest, a call to rise when others might falter. Trump's belief in her wasn't just a pat on the back, it was a torch handed to her in the dark, and she'd be damned if she let it flicker out. She set the phone down, her mind already racing, mapping out the steps ahead. But before she moved, before she stepped into the fray, there was something she needed, a moment to anchor herself. She reached for the small, worn Bible that sat on her desk, its leather cover soft beneath her fingers, its pages marked by years of quiet reflection. She flipped it open, not to a specific verse, but to the comfort of its presence, letting the words wash over her like a steadying breath. "Be strong and courageous," she murmured, the phrase a whisper from her past, a promise from her New Hampshire roots, where faith wasn't just a word but a way of life. In that fleeting pause, she found peace. Not the kind that lingers, but the kind that steels you for the tempest ahead. The blazer slipped over her shoulders, the silver cross catching the light as she adjusted it with care. It wasn't vanity, it was identity. She didn't need a mirror to know who she was, a woman forged in pressure, a voice for those who trusted her, a believer who wouldn't bend. The world outside her door was loud, relentless, a machine of ambition and conflict, but here, in this breath before the plunge, she was steady. The Bible returned to its place, a silent sentinel watching her go, and she grabbed her keys, her stride purposeful, as she headed for the sleek black SUV waiting below. Trump's words echoed in her mind as she slid into the driver's seat. Not a request, but a rallying cry. This wasn't about politics alone. It was about principle, about the soul of a nation that had always promised freedom yet too often forgot its own creed. She turned the key, the engine humming to life, and felt a flicker of something raw. Hope, yes, but laced with the thrill of a challenge unmet. She didn't know then that this drive would lead her to a courtroom where her voice would roar, where a single cross would become a banner, where one woman's stand would ripple across a country hungry for courage. But she felt it coming, a storm on the horizon, and she was ready to meet it head-on. The road stretched out before her, a path to a fight she hadn't chosen but wouldn't refuse. She was Karoline Levitt, not just a title, not just a name, but a force rising to meet the moment. And as the city blurred past her windows, she carried that small silver cross like a flame held high, a light no shadow could extinguish. Karoline Leavitt pushed through the doors of the D.C. local court, stepping into a storm she could feel but refused to let shake her. The air buzzed with restless voices, petty disputes, whispered complaints. But she moved with a stillness that cut through it all, her navy blazer crisp, the silver cross on her collar a quiet defiance. She found a seat, her document bag at her side, her phone ready to capture every word. This was no ordinary day, it was a mission, and she was armed with more than notes. She carried conviction. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on a young mother in the back row cradling a toddler against her chest. A silver cross hung from the woman's neck, identical to Karoline's, glinting faintly as the child squirmed. Their gazes met for a fleeting second, and Karoline saw it, a flicker of weariness, of hope, pinned to that small symbol. It hit her like a jolt. This wasn't just about her or Trump's orders. It was about every soul like that mother, clinging to faith in a world ready to strip it away. She straightened, resolve hardening in her bones. The wooden door behind the bench creaked open and Edward Grayson emerged, a man whose presence demanded silence without earning respect. At 60, he wore his black robe like armor, his graying hair slicked back, his eyes cold behind thin glasses. He settled into his chair, gavel in hand, and barked, "All rise." The room obeyed, Karoline among them, her chin lifted. Grayson's voice rolled out, heavy and edged with disdain. "This is a court of law. Order will be kept, no exceptions." Cases flew by, fines doled out, warnings issued, but Karoline's focus stayed razor-sharp, her fingers poised over her phone. Then Grayson's gaze snagged on her, his brows knitting as recognition dawned. He paused mid-sentence, papers rustling in his grip. "You?" he said, voice dropping low, icy. "Step forward." Karoline rose, her heels steady on the worn floor, and approached the bench. The crowd shifted, curious murmurs rippling. Grayson leaned forward, pointing at her collar. "That cross? It's a distraction, a flaunting of personal beliefs in a neutral space. This isn't a church. Remove it, or I'll fine you $500 for contempt." Her pulse thrummed, but her voice came clear, unshaken. "I'm Karoline Leavitt, White House press secretary, here on official duty. This cross is a personal item, protected by the First Amendment. It's not disrupting anything, unless you're saying faith itself is the problem." Grayson's lip curled, a sneer breaking through his judicial mask. "Don't lecture me, Ms. Leavitt. I know who you are. Some hotshot from the White House thinking you're above the rules. That thing on your neck? It's a statement, and I won't have it undermining my authority. $500, pay it, or leave." The young mother's face flashed in Karoline's mind. Those tired eyes, that fragile hope, and anger flared hot in her chest. "Your authority?" she shot back, her tone steady but cutting. "Where's that authority when others wear louder statements? I see a man over there in a shirt screaming, 'King of the streets,' a woman with a necklace bright enough to blind us all. You didn't blink at them. Why me? Why this cross?" Grayson banged his gavel, the sound sharp but hollow. "You're out of line. This isn't a debate club. It's my courtroom and I decide what's appropriate. That cross is a provocation, plain and simple. You think you can waltz in here and challenge me?" "I'm not challenging you," Karoline said, stepping closer, her eyes locked on his. "I'm asking for fairness. You call it provocation, but I call it freedom. If you're fining me, show me the rule I broke. Not your opinion, not your feelings, but the law. Can you?" His face reddened, knuckles whitening around the gavel. "I am the law here, Miss Leavitt. You don't get to demand citations from me. $500, end of discussion. Sit down or I'll have you removed." The crowd held its breath, tension coiling tight. Karoline didn't flinch. "Remove me then," she said, her voice rising just enough to carry. "But you'll have to explain why a woman observing a case breaking no rule gets punished while others don't. You're not targeting me, Judge Grayson. You're targeting what this cross stands for, and I won't let you bury that under your gavel." Grayson slammed the wood again, fury cracking his composure. "You're in contempt. You think you're untouchable because of who you work for? I've seen plenty like you. Arrogant, preaching faith like it's a shield. Pay the fine, or I'll double it." Karoline's jaw tightened, but her calm held firm. Double it if you want. It won't change the truth. I'm here for a case about Christians fighting to pray in public. A right you're stomping on right now. That mother back there, she nodded toward the woman with the toddler. She's watching. She's got a cross too. Will you find her next? Where does it stop? Grayson faltered, his glare darting to the back row, then back to Karoline. Enough! Sit down, or you're out. This isn't your stage. It's not yours either, she replied, soft but unyielding. It's theirs, the people's, and they deserve better than this. The room buzzed, eyes wide, whispers swelling. Grayson gripped his gavel like a lifeline, but Karoline stood tall, the silver cross gleaming, a symbol no fine could dim, a fight just beginning. Karoline Levitt stood at the defendant's bench, the air thick with the weight of Grayson's last gavel strike. But she wasn't done, not by a long shot. Edward Grayson loomed above her, his face flushed with the smug certainty of a man who thought he'd won. But she could feel it, the tide shifting, the spark catching, and she was ready to fan it into a blaze. The silver cross on her collar burned bright in her mind, not as a trinket but as a banner, and she wouldn't let it fall. You think this is over, she said, her voice steady, piercing the silence. You fined me $500 for contempt, Judge Grayson, but you've just opened a door you can't close. I'm not here to play games. I'm here for truth, and the truth is, you've got no ground to stand on. Grayson's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on the gavel. You're treading dangerous water, Ms. Levitt. I've ruled. You're done. Sit down, or I'll have you hauled out of here. Call me out, Karoline shot back, stepping closer, her tone rising with controlled fire. Go ahead, but first explain how fining me for this cross holds up under the First Amendment. You know it. Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion. Or do you think your bench trumps the Constitution? The crowd stirred, a ripple of gasps and whispers. Grayson banged his gavel, but the sound felt weaker, desperate. I don't need a civics lesson from you, he snapped. This is my courtroom, not a soapbox. That cross is a disruption. End of story. A disruption? Karoline's laugh was sharp, cutting through his bluster. You let a guy sit here with King of the Streets plastered across his chest, a woman with jewelry louder than a foghorn. But my cross, my faith, crosses the line. Call it what it is, Judge, bias. And I've got the law to prove it. Ever hear of Church of Lukumi Babalui v. City of Hialeah, 1993? Supreme Court banning religious symbols without a neutral, compelling reason is unconstitutional. Where's your reason? Grayson's face twisted, his voice rising to match hers. Don't you dare cite cases at me. I've been on this bench longer than you've been alive. I say it's disruptive, and that's enough. You're not a lawyer. You're a mouthpiece with a fancy title. Karoline didn't flinch, her eyes locking onto his. A mouthpiece? No. I'm a citizen with rights you're stomping on, and I don't need a law degree to know you're wrong. I've got the Constitution and a phone. Watch this. She pulled her device from her pocket, fingers flying as she launched an X Spaces session right there, her voice echoing into the digital void. This is Karoline Levitt, live from D.C. local court. They're fining me for wearing a cross, a right every American has. Join me. Fight back. The room erupted, murmurs swelling into a roar as phones lit up, people fumbling to tune in. Grayson slammed his gavel again, his shout ragged. Turn that off. This is contempt. Pure insolence. You think you can turn my court into a circus? It's not your court, Karoline fired back, her voice now amplified by the growing X-audience. It's ours, the people's, and they're listening. You fine me, but you can't fine freedom. You're losing control, Judge, because you're fighting a truth bigger than your gavel. Grayson's composure cracked, his hands trembling. You're slandering me in public. I'll have you arrested. $1,000 fine now. Shut that down, or you're finished. Arrest me? Karoline's tone turned steely, unshakable. For speaking, for believing. Go ahead, prove my point. Every word's recorded, every listener's watching. Faith Fights Back is trending already, hundreds joining in. You're not just facing me, you're facing them. Still think you can win? The crowd leaned forward, some nodding, others whispering furiously into their phones. A man in the back shouted, "She's right," before a bailiff hushed him. Grayson's glare darted around, his authority slipping like sand through his fingers. "This is chaos," he bellowed. "You're twisting everything. I maintain order here, not you." "Order," Karoline countered, her voice a blade of clarity. "You call targeting my cross order? I'm here observing a case, Christians suing to pray in public, and you're proving their fight right now. You're not upholding law, you're breaking it. Step back, Judge, or the people will make you." Grayson opened his mouth, but no words came. The X Spaces feed buzzed in Karoline's hand. Thousands now, voices piling on. "Stand strong. Grayson's done." He banged his gavel feebly, his shout hoarse. "Enough. Sit or—" "Yo, what?" Karoline cut in, calm but fierce. "You've got no play left. The law's on my side, the people are with me, and your bias is exposed. This isn't contempt, it's justice waking up." The room pulsed with energy. The crowd's support a living thing. Grayson slumped slightly, his gavel limp, as Karoline stood tall. The silver cross a torch, her voice a rallying cry, and the fight far from over. Karoline Levitt stepped out of the D.C. local court, the silver cross on her blazer catching the late afternoon sun like a signal flare. The battle inside had lit a fuse, and now the world beyond those doors was catching fire. Her phone buzzed relentlessly in her hand, the X Spaces session still alive, voices pouring in. Thousands now, a chorus of defiance and support echoing her stand. She paused, taking a deep breath, and felt the weight of it all shift from burden to triumph. This wasn't just her fight anymore, it was theirs, and they were running with it. Within minutes, Faith Fights Back exploded across X, a tidal wave of posts crashing through the digital landscape. "Karoline Levitt just took down a judge, for our rights," one user wrote, racking up retweets by the second. "Grayson's finished, Faith wins," another cheered. Her screen glowed with notifications, each one a spark adding to the blaze. Then came the voice she'd been waiting for. Donald Trump, his words booming through a post from his personal account. "Karoline Leavitt, my fearless press secretary, stood up to a tyrant judge and showed him what real American grit looks like. She's a champion for freedom, proud of her." The tweet surged past 60,000 retweets in under an hour, a thunderclap of approval that shook the nation's attention. Karoline's chest swelled with a quiet pride. But it wasn't over. Not yet. She glanced back at the courthouse steps, the echoes of Grayson's gavel still ringing in her mind, and made a choice. This moment deserved more than a hashtag. It needed a heartbeat. She tapped out a quick message on X. "Meet me outside the D.C. court in 30 minutes. Let's pray together, publicly, proudly." Faith Fights Back. She hit send, and the response was electric. Hundreds pledged to come, their words a lifeline pulling her forward. She wasn't just a witness now, she was a leader, and she'd carry this as far as it could go. By the time she stood on those steps again, the crowd had swelled. Men, women, children, their faces alight with purpose. A young man waved a sign, reading "Freedom Prays." A grandmother clutched a rosary, and that mother from the courtroom, toddler in arms, smiled at Karoline with unspoken gratitude. The silver crosses around their necks gleamed in unison, a constellation of belief under the open sky. Karoline raised her voice, simple and strong. "We're here because faith isn't a crime, it's our right. Let's show them what unity looks like." The group bowed their heads, their prayers rising like a song, a sound so pure it drowned out the memory of Grayson's scorn. Passers-by stopped, some joining in, others snapping photos. Faith Fights Back trending higher by the minute. The news spread beyond D.C., a ripple turning into a flood. In Texas, a pastor tweeted, "Karoline's courage is ours. Prayer vigils starting tonight." Ohio lawmakers vowed to review court policies, citing her stand as a wake-up call. Florida's governor posted a video, cross on his lapel, saying, "She's lit a fire for liberty, we're with her." X became a battlefield of hope, users sharing stories. "I was fined for a cross in court too. Grayson's not alone. Time to fight back." Karoline watched it unfold from her car, parked nearby, her heart racing with a joy she hadn't expected. This was victory. Not just hers, but theirs. a nation waking up to its own strength. Inside the courthouse, Edward Grayson sat alone in his chambers, the silence pressing against him like a judgment. His phone buzzed. Reporters, colleagues, the judicial council, all demanding answers he didn't have. He'd seen the X posts, Trump's praise, the prayer gathering forming outside his window. His hands shook as he gripped a cold mug. The smugness of hours ago, replaced by a gnawing unease. "She's just one woman," he muttered, but the words felt hollow. He'd swung his gavel to crush her, only to find it shattering his own foundation. The crowd's voices drifted in, soft but relentless, and for the first time he listened. Not to argue, but to hear. Something cracked inside him. Not surrender, but a question. Had he been wrong all along? Karoline hung up from a call with Trump's advisor, his voice buzzing with excitement. "You've got the country fired up, kid. The boss wants this loud statement tomorrow." She smiled, exhaustion mingling with elation. The prayer had ended, but its echo lingered, hundreds dispersing with lifted spirits, their crosses shining like badges of a shared win. She knew Grayson was reeling, his world tilting, and part of her hoped he'd see the light too, not for her sake, but for the mother with the toddler, the grandmother with the rosary, for every soul who'd felt that sting of unfairness and deserved better. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows, but Karoline felt only brightness ahead. From a courtroom skirmish to a nationwide surge, she'd sparked something unstoppable. She whispered to herself, "This is just the start," and believed it. Because when faith and freedom joined hands, no gavel could hold them back. Karoline Leavitt stood at the edge of the White House briefing room, the silver cross on her navy blazer catching the camera flashes like a quiet vow made loud. Days had turned into weeks since that courtroom clash, but the fire she'd ignited hadn't dimmed. It had grown, spreading across a nation hungry for something to believe in. She wasn't just the youngest press secretary anymore. She was a symbol, a voice that had roared when silence would have been easier. The $500 fine receipt hung framed on her office wall, not as a trophy but as a reminder. One spark, one stand could change everything. The crowd before her, reporters, activists, everyday Americans, watched with eyes wide, hands clutching signs that read, "Faith Lives," and Karoline's cross. She stepped to the podium, her voice steady but warm, carrying the weight of a journey she'd never planned but wholly embraced. 3 weeks ago, I walked into a courtroom to do my job, she began. A judge fined me for this cross for my faith. I fought back, not just for me, but for every one of you who's ever been told your beliefs don't belong. Today, we're not just standing, we're building something stronger. The room erupted in applause, a sound that felt like a heartbeat pulsing with pride and possibility. Her fight had reshaped the landscape. The D.C. Judicial Council, spurred by her clash with Edward Grayson, rolled out new rules. No bans on religious symbols without clear cause, mandatory training for every judge and clerk on the First Amendment. Karoline had pushed for it, her voice unwavering in late-night calls with lawmakers, her words sharp with purpose. This isn't about me, it's about fairness for all. Beyond D.C., states like Texas and Ohio launched their own reforms, governors citing her courage as the push they'd needed. On X, Faith Fights Back still trended, a living testament to a movement that refused to fade. But Karoline saw further than policy. She saw people. The mother from the courtroom, the grandmother at the prayer vigil, the countless messages flooding her inbox. "You gave me hope. I'm not afraid anymore." That's when the idea struck, a vision born from the ashes of that fine. She announced it now, her voice lifting with quiet fire. "I'm starting the Freedom Faith Scholarship, full rides for law students who'll fight for religious liberty. The next generation deserves to know their rights are worth defending." The crowd cheered, a wave of joy washing over her. She pictured a young woman, maybe 19, clutching a law book, emboldened by a story that started with a cross and a courtroom. That was her legacy, not just a win, but a seed planted deep. She'd grown through this, from a woman thrust into a storm to a leader steering the ship. Every briefing, every speech, every late night poring over legal texts had sharpened her, but it was the people, their trust, their voices, that lifted her higher. Trump clapped her shoulder backstage, his grin wide. "You're a warrior, Karoline. America loves you, and so do I. Keep it burning." She nodded, feeling the weight of his faith in her, but knowing it was the nation's heartbeat that drove her now. She wasn't just his voice anymore. She was theirs. And she'd carry that mantle with every ounce of her soul. Edward Grayson watched her speech from a small TV in a training room, no robe on his shoulders, just a plain suit and a humble gaze. The Judicial Council had suspended him, but he'd chosen a different path, not retreat, but redemption. He'd joined the First Amendment training he once would have mocked, standing before clerks and bailiffs, his voice raspy but earnest. "I thought I was right," he'd said that first day, hands clasped tight. "Karoline Leavitt showed me I wasn't. Don't let pride blind you. Listen, learn, do better." He'd seen her prayer vigil on those steps, heard the stories of others he'd find, and felt the crack in his old armor widen. It wasn't easy facing that mirror, but he owed it. To her, to them, to himself. Karoline had heard of his change, and though she'd never say it aloud, a quiet hope flickered. Even the hardest hearts could turn. She stepped onto the White House balcony that night, the city sprawling beneath a sunset sky, and touched the cross on her collar. It wasn't just a symbol of faith now, it was resilience, a mark of what one person could do when they refused to bow. The scholarship fund was growing, applications pouring in, the reforms were spreading, state by state, and Grayson's voice, however small, was joining the chorus. She smiled, a soft breath escaping her lips. "One spark," she whispered, "and look what it's done." The nation felt it too, pride in a woman who turned a fine into a fight, inspiration in a movement that wouldn't quit, faith in a system that could bend toward justice. Karoline Leavitt wasn't finished. She'd lead, she'd build, she'd inspire, because she knew now, one voice rooted in truth could shake the world. And as the stars lit up over D.C., she stood ready for whatever came next, the cross gleaming like a promise unbroken. The deepest lesson from Karoline's story is this: one voice, rooted in conviction, can topple giants and light the way for millions. She didn't just defend her cross, she defended a principle, showing that courage isn't loud or reckless, it's steady, smart, and unshakable. In today's world, where battles over rights and beliefs rage on, her story teaches us to stand firm, whether it's in a courtroom, a classroom, or a conversation. Know your ground like she knew the Constitution. Amplify your fight like she did with X, and lift others as she did with her scholarship. You don't need power or a title, just the will to act. Apply it now, speak up when it's hard, support what's right, and build something lasting. One spark from you could be the next fire that changes everything. Love Karoline's story? Want more tales of grit, faith, and triumph? Hit that subscribe button and join our community. Your support fuels these stories. Every click, every share keeps the fire burning. Don't miss what's next. Subscribe now and let's keep inspiring together.